Hi, Modern Global Issues students. So today we're going to continue Unit 2. We're looking at, the birth and growth of modern nations, but we're switching regions. So whereas we had been looking at Korea, today we're going to switch gears and we're going to look at post-colonial Africa. Our big question is, how has colonialism contributed to the problems that Africa is facing today, with problems like civil war, education, healthcare, and poverty? How do we relate those to colonialism? In order for us to understand some of the modern issues or even the history of colonial and post-colonial Africa, we need to break down some of the vocab terms that are necessary to understand this part of the world. So colonialism is the practice of taking full or partial control over another country, maybe occupying it with settlers, maybe not, but definitely it's a powerful country taking over a smaller country and wanting to use their resources. You've probably studied that phenomenon in the past, but our modern world is really marked more by a post-colonial experience where a continent like Africa and nations within Africa are looking around and wondering, okay, now what do we do now? The Europeans are gone and we're living in a post-colonial world. So what happens next? The third term I want us to be aware of is ethnocentrism or centrism. And that is like where you look at another culture, but you have your own preconceived notions, your own biases based on your culture and the rules, both written and unwritten, that govern your own culture. So it's where you evaluate another culture with your own biases, which can sometimes be harmful. Subjugation is a word that's going to come up. Subjugation is the act of bringing someone or something under control. So in the context we'll be looking at it, Europe subjugated Africa, many parts of Africa, to their rule. Or something way off topic, my daughters often find themselves subjugated to my rule in my household. So that's a term that we can use to describe one power being in control of another. The last term I want you to be aware of is Afro-pessimism. That refers to the perception that there are places in Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, that have too many problems, that they can't have a good government, they won't ever have a good economy. And so that pessimism about that place is something that I'm not saying it's true at all, but it's a phenomenon that can affect our look at many places in Africa. More valuable than just hearing my voice, I want you to watch this clip of an expert from Brown University talking about what what colonialism is, and then we'll look at what post-colonialism is next.
Colonialism is a broad
Something else that can be helpful to look at is how, if we're going to understand the post-colonial world, how Africans who were living during the time of colonialism, how did they resist that? So here's an expert on that phenomenon.
I think from day one, people felt that this was not in their best interest. So some people fought. We have records of battles. They lost some, they won some. One of the important things to remember about the African continent is it is a vast continent. You can put the entire United States of America in the African continent and still have space. And this is a big place, right? So that gives you an idea of the vastness. So besides resistance, what happened in many instances is that people moved. So, colonial folks are coming, so you move to another space. And colonialism really is not just about extraction of raw materials and creation of insertion into a world economy, but it's also about creating a new set of people through creation of the native. And then one ways in which Africans resisted that was through religion. So things like Ethiopia, and therefore, and that led to development or the emergence, if you wish, of a set of prophets and prophetess, both men and women, who really preached against colonialism. And there was, there was the usual thing once the trade unions were formed, strikes, and there were battles like the Kikuyu battle against the British, what became known as the Mammoth Revolt. So there were many revolts, there was armed rebellion, and there was religious, different religious systems.
Let's read through a timeline of events in Africa to try to understand colonialism and what that meant. So 1482 is when the first permanent trading post was built by the Portuguese. This is one of the European powers in West Africa. In 1505, the first permanent trading post was built by the Portuguese in East Africa. In 1518, the first cargo of enslaved Africans shipped across the Atlantic Ocean. In 1652, the Dutch started a trading post at the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa. In 1780 is really where we see the slave trade reach its peak. 1884 to 1885 is when European colonial powers define their regions of control in Africa at the Berlin Conference. This is where we really see the Europeans say, hey, this is now ours. 1914 is when European nations gained control of nearly all of Africa. And what I might be cutting off here in the box is more of what's been going on in modern times in the process of decolonization. And we'll definitely be looking at that in depth. The Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885 is a thing to know. What we see right before the eve of that conference is that we'd already seen the Portuguese and the British and the French and the Ottomans trying to control these places, but it's after the Berlin Conference that Europe will really make sure that they're in control. And it's not just Europe. I mean, the whole world was looking at this vast land of resources that Africa has, and they wanted a piece. And so, this image here shows you just kind of that competition for the bountiful, rich resource rich place that is the continent of Africa. Yeah. And the Portuguese, the Spanish, Italians, Germans, French, Belgium, the Netherlands, all were in this competition. This is a phrase to know right here. We're in this competition, this scramble for Africa. A lot of the colonialism took place in sub-Saharan Africa, but when you look at this map, you can see that there are hardly any places that were under African rule. Instead, it had been carved up and diced up based on the interest of these European powers. In some of these places, what we see is direct rule, where the people in charge of that land and the people living on that land were the Dutch, were the French, were the Germans, etc. Sometimes we see indirect rule, where maybe the British will take the resources from a place, but they'll leave the people in charge to local leadership. World wars will get in the way, where, because Germany loses its territory, the League of Nations will decide who's in charge of different parts of Africa. But then there are also traditional colonies, like you would think of when it comes to the United States, settler colonies, where people from that home nation will settle into the country in Africa, like Dutch settling into South Africa, or the British settling into South Africa, something like that. The rationale for this colonialism really is based on the fact that Europe wanted the raw materials, that they needed those raw materials to fuel the Industrial Revolution, and it also just guaranteed markets for the colonizer, and it's viewed as just an economic opportunity. But the impact for the people living there, when we look at that, we can see that it introduces new diseases into the colony. We can see that as these European countries look for materials, we see slave labor introduced into Africa. That children are often used, African children are used as a cheap source of labor. So colonialism, its impact on the continent itself is not positive, whereas for the European power, they're going to gain a lot from their colonies. When we look at resources in Africa and how they were exploited, what we're talking about is that, in an effort to gain these resources, imperialist powers were willing to go to extreme measures. People were kidnapped. Africans were forced into slavery in pursuit of these resources. The European powers will decide that the Africans are unskilled and unnecessary. And so they'll be pushed out, killed in an effort to get to the resources. And control was really in the hands of the imperialists, regardless of what that meant for the people of Africa. So African farmers all across the continent who had been farming this land for centuries, all of a sudden had to turn over ownership of their lands, of their resources to the imperialist powers. And that's why when we talk about resources, that sometimes it's viewed as a curse, that yes, there is tons of oil and natural gas and coffee and iron ore and diamonds in Africa, copper, but that for Africa itself, at least in the past several centuries, that almost has been a negative because of how Africa has been used by European powers. In an effort to gain control, the European powers kind of created their own definition of what it was to be African. They created the myth of the tribe and tribal characteristics. When Europeans divided up borders, they didn't do it based on natural borders. They didn't think about separating it based on language or ethnic groups. It was just a policy of divide and rule based on whatever was good for the imperialist powers. And that's what the Christian missionaries wanted as well. When we look at the 3 C's of colonialism, it's not just all about economics. It is about even Christian missionary groups and humanitarian groups that really defined like the 3 C's, that commerce as a prime factor in promoting Christianity and civilization in Africa. Commerce is the economic part. Hey, it's a prime factor, but if you colonize, you might get resources, but you can promote Christianity. Isn't that a good thing? And promote so-called civilization. Hey, aren't you really doing Africans a favor? It was that kind of attitude at the time. So what happened to Africa when the Europeans left? When the Europeans left, they left behind a continent that had bad government leaders, that was corrupt. They left behind a continent and nations that were just prime candidates to have a genocide. They left a continent that is prone to natural disasters, that many places have poor economies, and that has lack of resources because it really had been plundered for their natural resources, and there wasn't any kind of investment in their education systems or anything that could have benefited Africa. So as we go to look at modern Africa, one of the nations that we need to know is the modern nation of Sudan. So we're going to be looking at Sudan and then South Sudan, the youngest nation in the world. So that'll be a big topic for us in the remainder of the week and next week as well. Thank you for watching.